global set of interconnectors. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generating capacity will be needed, where the health of the poor is jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood and dung, and where there'll be otherwise pressure to build coal-fired power stations. It's hard to conceive a more inspiring goal for young scientists, technologists, and engineers than to ensure sustainable food and energy supplies in the coming decade. The case for urgent action to cut CO2 emissions is compelling, but politicians tend to focus on the short term before the next election and on their own constituency or nation. They won't prioritize measures that benefit people in remote parts of the world decades ahead unless there's public clamor from their voters. So scientists must enhance this clamor by engaging with NGOs, via blogging and journalism, and enlisting charismatic individuals and the media to amplify their voice. For instance, Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si, had a worldwide influence in the lead up to COP20 in Paris. There's no gainsaying the Church's global reach, its long-term vision, and its concern for the world's poor. And it's encouraging to witness more activists, especially among the young, people who may see the dawn of the 22nd century. We should all be evangelists for new technology. Without it, the world can't provide sustainable energy, nourishing food, and good health for an expanding and more demanding population. But many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and its misuse can give us a bumpy ride through the century. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing natural pandemics. But the same research raises the prospect of engineered pandemics. Regulation of biotech is needed. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds, they can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done by someone, somewhere, will be done. And that's a nightmare. And what about other technologies? The smartphone, the web, etc., ubiquitous today, would have seemed magic even just 25 years ago. So looking as far ahead as 2050, we must keep our minds open to innovations that may now seem science fiction and which we can't predict. Robotics and AI are advancing fast. And it is, of course, the speed of computers which allows them to do this, to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. If they're merely given the rules of a game like chess or Go, they can beat world champions after a few hours, during which they can gain expertise by playing hundreds of thousands of games against themselves. But they can do all those things, but learning about human behavior is hard for them. It involves observing real people in real homes or workplaces. And the machine would feel sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life and would be bewildered. It's like us watching trees grow. That's why it's hard for machines to learn the common sense and ethics, which are going to be crucial for their safe deployment. And robots still can't sense or interact with their surroundings as well as flesh and blood creatures. They're clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard, and they can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel. But what if an AI developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or would it go rogue? Some AI pundits take this threat seriously, and they think the field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. But others, like for instance Rodney Brooks, the inventor of the Baxter robot and the Roomba vacuum cleaner, they regard these concerns as premature. think it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence is a bigger worry than real stupidity is. But be that as it may, it's likely that society and the nature of work will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury is out on whether those robots will be idiot savants or really display all-round superhuman capabilities. But it's in my own special field, space exploration, which robots and AI have the greatest scope and where they raise the fewest concerns. So a word about that. During this century, the entire solar system will be explored by flotillas of tiny robotic craft. Robots will assemble vast lightweight structures in space, use telescopes, solar energy collectors, and such like. But will people follow them? A few may go to the moon or even to Mars, but don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Coping with climate change is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. You've got to cherish our earthly home. Indeed, the cosmic perspective actually strengthens our concerns about what happens here and now. That's because it offers a vision of just how special our Earth is and how prolonged and how prodigious life's future could be. In the aeons that lie ahead, even more marvelous diversity could emerge. The unfolding of intelligence and complexity could still be far from its culmination. We're all surely mindful of the heritage we've inherited from our forebears. If our generation are negligent stewards, poor ancestors, as it were, we shall not only jeopardize the welfare of our children and grandchildren, but risk foreclosing vast future potentialities in the longer term. Opinion polls show that, unsurprisingly, younger people who expect to survive most of the century are more engaged and more anxious about long-term and global issues, and their activism gives ground for hope. So what should be our message to them? It's surely that there's no scientific impediments to achieving a sustainable world where all enjoy a lifestyle better than those in rich countries do today. We live under the shadow of new risks, but these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields like biotech, advanced AI, and geoengineering, and by reprioritizing the thrust of the world's technological effort. So we can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology do engender pessimism. The scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, and unintended consequences of advanced technology could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And of course, most of the challenges are global. Coping with COVID-19 is plainly a global challenge, and the threats of potential shortages of food, water, and natural resources, and transforming to low carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately. Nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations, especially those spearheaded by globe-spanning commercial conglomerates. Indeed, a key issue is whether, in a new world order, nations will need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations to deal with climate and energy, for instance, along the lines of the WHO and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Scientists have an obligation to promote beneficial applications of their work and to warn against the downsides. And as Catherine Rhodes has said, universities should offer their staff's expertise and their convening power to assess how best to avoid echo threats or risks from misapplied technology. Politicians do indeed focus on immediate threats like COVID-19, but as I said, they won't prioritize the global and long-term measures needed to deal with threats to climate and biodiversity, unless the press and their inboxes keep these high on their agenda. Science advisors to government, and I've known quite a few of them, have limited influence except in emergencies. These people must enhance their leverage by engagement with NGOs, by blogging and journalism, and by enlisting charismatic individuals as diverse as Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and Bill Gates, all of them to amplify their voice. Politicians will make wise long-term decisions, but only if they feel they won't lose votes by doing so. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. For a better tomorrow, we need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for helping us to think globally, locally, and in the long term. Very much needed. And I would like now to call Mathieu Baudin for his speech. Mathieu.
Merci beaucoup. Merci de m'avoir invité dans ce panel, dans ce pays, même si j'aurais voulu être parmi vous au Brésil, un pays ô combien enchanteur, même s'il vit des heures difficiles, que nous sommes tous en train de vivre plus ou moins à des tessitures différentes. Merci aussi de me laisser m'exprimer dans ma langue, en français, puisque les mots sont précis et précieux, et que chaque culture porte en soi, à travers sa langue, peut-être une partie des solutions que les autres cultures n'ont pas vues ou n'ont pas accès parce qu'elles ne connaissent pas encore la beauté de tel ou tel concept. Moi-même, j'ai découvert la philosophie du buen vivir venant d'Équateur, quelque chose qui résonne particulièrement en ce moment. Donc, merci de me laisser vous partager une partie de notre énergie en France, à l'Institut des futurs souhaitables, qui porte sur elle finalement son ambition. On est assez transparent, on fait de la prospective et on essaye de se concentrer sur un futur qui donne envie d'aller vers lui, plutôt qu'un futur sinistré qui nous donnerait d'autres choix que d'être condamné, bien conscient quand même que si l'on ne fait rien, on ira vers ce futur-là, bien conscient également que si on s'y met tous, on pourrait influer sur les trajectoires. Je voulais remercier aussi les panélistes qui sont là, puisque vous êtes une partie de nos sources. Et j'aimerais aussi remercier les traductrices qui font un travail ô combien nécessaire pour rapprocher justement, converger les peuples vers un demain qui soit autre que celui qu'on nous promet. Donc l'Institut des futurs souhaitables, on met des pluriels dans notre intitulé justement pour éviter l'affrontement des uniques qui peut-être a enflammé le XXe siècle. Il y aura des futurs, il y aura des possibles, il y aura des variables, il y aura des demains. Et je pense que déjà mettre un peu de pluriel dans sa vie, ça nous permet justement d'éviter la doxa unique d'un futur qui serait déjà écrit. Alors l'Institut, nous, on a 150 experts de plein de domaines différents qui travaillent dans notre aventure. Et puis, on les fait travailler ensemble, on les fait s'hybrider en symbiose et on demande à des artistes de donner une partie de ce qu'ils ont produit pour le donner au grand public, pour essayer d'inspirer le débat public de futurs qui soient autres que ceux qu'on nous promet. Je ne sais pas pour vous, mais nous, dans nos médias, on a un tropisme, on est plutôt sujet à voir demain comme une réalité augmentée de ce que l'humanité a de pire. On a beaucoup de scénarios de science-fiction dans nos films qui sont toujours à peu près de la même chose. Un futur noir, un futur vertical, un futur où l'environnement est game over, et un futur où le seul espoir qui reste à l'humanité, c'est l'amour. Voilà le scénario des 50 dernières années des films de science-fiction et certainement des 20 ou 30 prochaines années. Alors qu'il me semble que quand j'ai lu Jules Verne, à la fin du 19e, il n'y avait pas autant d'écrits dystopiques que ça. Il y a quelque chose dans la colonisation de notre imaginaire qui s'est passé, qui voit demain comme une érosion du présent. Or, demain, jusqu'à preuve du contraire, et profondément ce que nous allons en faire, c'est la grande leçon, ou en tout cas le grand héritage de toutes celles et ceux qui, avant nous, ont imaginé la prospective, cet art d'imaginer les futurs. Alors, quand vous avez le temps, en prospective, vous avez autant de scénarios que de gens pour le faire. Mais en gros, il y a 4 tendances. La première tendance, c'est le tendanciel, justement. Vous prenez l'existant et vous le prorogez. Et force est de constater que le tendanciel aujourd'hui nous conduit dans le scénario noir, puisque notre système, tel qu'il a été pensé en d'autres temps, en d'autres siècles, est mortifère, pour plein de raisons. Le deuxième scénario, c'est le scénario noir, le dark scénario, un scénario cathartique qui nous montre là où il ne faut pas aller. Et c'est vrai qu'en nous faisant peur, en mettant en scène le fantasme négatif de absolument pas du tout ce qui est souhaitable, eh bien, ça crée une trajectoire. Quand vous êtes capitaine d'un grand navire qui est un État, quand on vous dit qu'il y a un iceberg à droite, un iceberg à gauche, un iceberg encore à droite, ça crée une trajectoire par défaut, mais ça crée quand même une trajectoire. Puis il y a le scénario de rupture, le grand amateur, toutes les conférences du monde d'innovation adorent ces scénarios-là. C'est un petit fait, petit, ici et maintenant, qui, s'il passe à l'échelle, ça change tout. Et tout l'art de la prospective est de dénicher ces signaux faibles avant qu'ils n'adviennent. Et puis, il y a le scénario souhaitable. Et les scénarios souhaitables, à la différence des trois premiers qui prennent l'existant et qui tirent des courbes en haut, en bas, en continuité, le scénario souhaitable, lui, il va à la destination, en l'occurrence pour nous 2040. On se prend le temps collectivement de voir ce que l'on veut voir advenu, on se le dit, on converge, et puis on recule, on fait du backcasting, comme on le dit si joliment en franglais, et on arrive à maintenant, et quand on se retourne, on voit une trajectoire, on voit une stratégie. Eh bien, en France, et j'imagine un peu partout dans le monde, on a rarement le temps de se poser pour exprimer sa volonté. Et donc, l'Institut des futurs souhaitables a remédié à ça en justement prenant au sérieux ses rêves pour en faire une stratégie. C'est à ça qu'on invite les pouvoirs publics, les médias et toutes celles et ceux qui passent par chez nous. Alors, notre artisanat, nous, c'est de faire des voyages dans le futur. Tous les 6 mois, on prend le temps du temps. Et le grand secret, c'est que pour comprendre le temps, il faut prendre le temps. J'irai même plus loin, il est urgent de prendre le temps. La célérité qui nous est proposée dans l'époque, elle n'a pas toujours été le cas. Nos grands-parents nous rappelaient que pour aller loin, il faut ménager sa monture. Il semblerait qu'on l'ait oublié. Le court-termisme est arrivé dans nos vies un peu de manière insidue. Personne n'a jamais voté pour ça, mais le temps long n'est plus l'horizon de temps des politiques, des entreprises ou même des collectivités locales. Or, ça n'a pas toujours été le cas. Donc, retrouver le temps du temps est, à mon avis, une grande urgence. Donc, nous, tous les 6 mois, on prend le temps d'aller en 2040 avec une cinquantaine d'intervenants qui viennent dans un parcours un peu initiatique, qui viennent nous faire d'une formation une transformation. Et on a des protagonistes qui viennent du monde de l'entreprise, de l'État, des journalistes, des étudiants, des artistes qui viennent prendre le temps justement de voir ce qu'ils vont faire dans le monde. On fait ça depuis une trentaine de fois, on a 10 ans de recul, et j'aimerais vous partager un peu une partie des leçons et des invitations que ces voyages dans le futur nous donnent. La première, c'est qu'on n'a pas d'autre choix que de changer. Et donc, c'est une forme de condamnation poétique, une belle condamnation. En gros, le système sur lequel est basée nos sociétés, particulièrement occidentales, mais pour le coup, l'Occident est un modèle à son corps défendant ou volontairement, ce qui fait qu'un système pensé à la fin de la guerre, de la Seconde Guerre, au milieu du XXe siècle, pensé pour 450 millions d'individus, en gros, les Occidentaux, ayant toutes les ressources de la Terre à leur disposition et de mauvaise manière, penser que ce système peut se proroger alors qu'on est 9 milliards et que la Terre n'a pas grossi, il n'y a pas 5 terres pour alimenter ce système, c'est non seulement une hérésie, mais en plus un problème mathématique. On n'a pas les ressources nécessaires à notre gourmandise. Et donc, il nous faut nécessairement changer l'appétit qui guide le monde. Moi, je trouve que c'est une belle condamnation. Il y a assez peu d'humains, le temps de leur vie, qui ont eu ce sentiment de devoir changer quelque chose. Et puis, il y a plus de risques à ne pas bouger qu'à bouger. Donc, l'inertie n'est pas une solution. Et donc, à minima, ça force à une introspection de ce que l'on fait. Et dans les boîtes, les grandes structures, il y a tout un élan pour re-questionner la raison d'être, le purpose. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait et pourquoi on est là et à quoi on contribue, ce qui est une démarche hautement philosophique. L'autre chose qui est, à mon avis, intéressante, en tout cas moi qui m'intéresse, c'est une phrase qui m'a beaucoup marqué, c'est si Mère Teresa et le Dalai Lama joue au Monopoly, la fin est toujours la même. Ce n'est pas un problème de joueur, c'est un problème de jeu. On peut venir avec les meilleures intentions du monde. On peut se transformer par la spiritualité laïque, par la spiritualité, ce que vous voulez. Si on joue au Monopoly, il y aura deux perdants. Il y a celui qui a tout et celui qui a rien. L'un ne pouvant pas jouer avec l'autre puisque le jeu est à mort collective. Donc l'idée bien est de changer le système, évidemment, mais de changer les règles du système qui nous ont conduits à vivre dans un système aujourd'hui et peut-être pas le même demain. La bonne nouvelle, à force de prendre le temps du temps aussi, c'est que quelle que soit l'obédience de départ, quelle que soit la civilisation, quel que soit le statut social, quel que soit le champ, même disciplinaire, quand on prend le temps de la complexité, on arrive à converger à la suite. Un exemple, après nos voyages dans les souhaitables, il y a toujours un profond re-questionnement sur la place de l'humain par rapport à la nature. Et ce, quel que soit le continent, quel que soit finalement d'où vous parlez, vous allez être amené à reconsidérer la place de l'humanité par rapport à la nature, ce qui était le grand acquis de la Renaissance, ce qui nous a libérés pendant 500 ans et qui maintenant nous aliène. Donc, il y a 1000 manières pour questionner cette problématique, mais tout le monde se pose cette question-là avec plus ou moins d'avance. Là, pour le coup, l'Occident a du retard, là où les Quechua n'ont pas perdu ce lien à la nature que nous avons savamment coupé. Donc, il y a quelque chose, moi, qui me rassure, c'est que ce n'est pas quelque chose de partisan, aller vers un futur souhaitable, c'est quelque chose de l'ordre de la volonté, de la convergence. Et donc, encore une fois, quelle que soit l'obédience de départ, on converge vers une société qui pourrait être plus équilibrée. Et par contre, on a un problème en prospective, ce n'est pas parce que l'on sait que l'on fait. Et donc, il y a énormément de gens dans tous les États du monde qui connaissent la gravité des problèmes depuis très longtemps, et pourtant, les décisions ne sont pas prises. Donc, il y a quelque chose de l'ordre de la mise en action qui manque, en plus que de la connaissance des risques et des problèmes si on ne bouge pas. Et donc, nous, nos modalités d'action, c'est d'abord d'avoir rassuré, rasséréné toutes celles et ceux qui se sentent anormaux. Et vous savez, l'anormalité et l'extraordinaire, c'est un peu la même chose, sauf qu'on ne regarde pas du même côté. Et moi, je trouve que tous ces gens qui veulent faire différent ne sont pas des anormaux d'une société, ce sont des explorateurs de la société suivante. Donc, juste leur dire ça, c'est changer de regard sur eux et les inviter à changer de regard sur eux-mêmes. Et en plus, leur dire qu'ils ne sont pas isolés, on est légion partout dans le monde, au Brésil, à Cambridge, à Princeton, même au Japon, bien évidemment, il y a des femmes et des hommes qui sont en avance de phase et qui sont en train d'expérimenter sur eux une partie de ce qu'ils veulent voir dans le monde. Et puis moi, j'irais même plus loin, il y a une inversion de la charge de la preuve. Les fous, c'est plus celles et ceux qui font des alternatives. Je pense que la folie a changé de camp. Les fous, ce sont plutôt celles et ceux qui pensent que le système peut continuer comme ça, sans rien changer. Et donc, juste l'inversion de la charge de la preuve nous fait gagner un peu de temps et on peut aller dans l'exploration. Et à ce moment-là de notre partage, j'aimerais vous parler d'un rêve et de 3 A. Le rêve, c'est un concept de Patrick Vivray que vous allez recevoir aussi dans cette noble assemblée le 11 mai, je crois. En fait, il résume l'esprit de l'époque. On est dans un mouvement, dans une énergie. Et il dit il faut faire toutes ces choses en même temps. Le premier R, c'est la résistance créative. Il nous invite à résister, à faire un opasaran, un yabasta par rapport à tout ce qu'on ne veut plus voir dans le monde. Si, comme moi, vous êtes effaré par l'évasion fiscale, il est temps de dire stop. Le E, c'est l'expérimentation anticipatrice. Il nous invite à faire sur nous le changement qu'on veut voir dans le monde et mettre en application cette belle phrase de Gandhi qui nous invitait à faire cela. Et le V, c'est la vision transformatrice, c'est quelle histoire on se raconte pour changer de trajectoire. Et c'est là que les futurs souhaitables interviennent, qui parlent en connaissance de cause d'un futur qui donne envie d'aller vers lui. Et donc, le dernier élément qu'on ajoute à cette alchimie, c'est d'essayer en tout cas le beau au service de l'utile et demander aux artistes en responsabilité de venir nous aider à raconter d'autres histoires pour d'autres trajectoires. Et on voit que le futur est colonisé, qu'il y a une bataille des imaginaires en ce moment, que parfois nos cousins, les collapsologues, qui nous parlent d'un effondrement proche, en fait, tétanisent une partie de l'énergie dont on aurait besoin pour faire différemment. Donc oui, il faut être conscient du monde tel qu'il pourrait advenir, mais oui, aussi, on peut faire des choses ensemble, et tout l'enjeu est de donner cette confiance à celles et ceux qui veulent bouger ensemble. Donc nous, on a plein de modalités pratiques, on a des armes de construction massive, donc on a plein de petites choses à faire pour changer ici et maintenant en fonction de si vous êtes en place dans une entreprise, si vous êtes en place dans un ministère, si vous êtes en place dans votre école, tout simplement. Donc il y a plein de petits cadeaux, de petites armes, de petits outils à faire. Je vous en donne un qui a une poésie folle. Comme moi, je pense, souvent, vous vous dites, je n'ai pas le temps de faire cela. Il y a plein de choses où on n'a jamais le temps de faire cela. Eh bien, une petite arme de construction massive facile, c'est un cadeau de temps. Vous prenez un rendez-vous avec quelqu'un que vous aimez bien. Dans 3 mois, avec Martin, je prends un rendez-vous, un vendredi, entre 15h30 et 17h30, et vous le notez dans l'agenda. Et le vendredi, le matin, j'appellerai Martin en disant « Désolé, on ne va pas se voir, Martin, mais je vous fais un cadeau de temps. Vous avez 2 heures pour faire quelque chose que vous n'avez jamais le temps de faire. » En fait, c'est tellement inapproprié puisqu'il n'aura pas le temps de remplir son agenda qu'il aura 2 cadeaux. 1, la liste de ce qu'il n'a jamais le temps de faire, et 2, le temps pour commencer à faire quelque chose. Voilà comment juguler quelque chose qui a l'air d'être insurmontable. Et puis, la beauté de notre aventure nous conduit à faire des uchronies, mais dans le futur. Donc, on essaye à la télé française d'être en 2040, le temps d'une expérience de pensée, et on raconte ce qui s'est passé entre 2021 et 2040. Et ça sert une chose, ça sert à dépasser le temps d'un instant, le « c'est impossible » par « c'est fait », et voilà ce que ça a changé. Parce qu'à chaque fois que quelqu'un propose une alternative, il y a toujours quelqu'un ou quelqu'une pour vous dire « c'est trop petit, c'est trop grand, c'est trop français, c'est trop parisien, c'est trop brésilien, que sais-je », mais on ne se prend jamais le temps d'essayer de voir la mise à l'échelle et la mise à l'impact, justement, réussie de votre alternative. Et donc, l'art est là pour ça, la poésie est là pour ça, et donc on excelle, en tout cas on s'y essaye à faire cela. Et donc pour conclure et rester dans les 15 minutes, vous avez bien compris que la prospective pour nous, c'est un terrain de volonté humaine, et qu'il est plus que temps de prendre au sérieux ses rêves et d'en faire une stratégie, puisque l'autre alternative ne tient plus. Et puisque on a commencé avec de l'étymologie, moi il y en a 2 que j'aime bien. Le désir, étymologiquement, ou plutôt l'inverse, l'antonyme, c'est la sidération. En gros, on est dans une société sidérée en ce moment. Eh bien, une des solutions, c'est de parler du désir, de ce que l'on veut voir advenir pour dépasser la sidération. Et la deuxième, qui vient du latin, c'est que aventure et avenir, en français, ça a la même racine. Donc plutôt que de penser qu'on est en train de juguler un effondrement, peut-être qu'on est à l'aune de vivre une grande aventure, une grande épopée qui feront peut-être parler dans les siècles à venir, et ils nous diront peut-être avec mes petits-enfants, papy, grand-père, qu'est-ce que tu as fait toi dans la grande métamorphose? Et je lui répondrai que j'ai eu le plaisir de parler avec des gens exceptionnels à Rio de Janeiro. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. I like the idea of people being considered as exploiters of the future. That's a nice definition, nice concept. Thank you very much for your talk, Mathieu. Very enlightening indeed. Now, I would like to ask Miguel Centeno to transmit his thoughts to us. Thank you very much, Miguel.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, Ana Cília, for the invitation. My apologies for having to speak in English. My portuñol is truly awful, and I would not subject anyone to that. I also want to apologize, the very American habit of having a PowerPoint. It just helps me, so you should see it, and let me put it on slideshow. I've been doing this for a year now, and I think you should all see a slide. Is that correct?
Okay. Yes.
So,
yes.
Okay. So I put a question mark on desirability of tomorrow, and my talk is going to be somewhat pessimistic because I'm trying to define what the problems are that we're facing and some of the issues that we're going to have to deal with. So just to start, defining the problem, the first part, it's the battle between efficiency and fragility. Karl Marx already notes this in the 19th century when he talks about capitalism's almost ability to eat itself, what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Yes, it can be creative, but it can also be very destructive. And we have created a system that relies on massive efficiency, where optimization is the only way to work. If you do not optimize, that is, lower your labor costs, lower your resource costs, et cetera, you will not survive. And we have created an incredibly elaborate and very efficient system of global production. We now produce more food, more stuff. Life expectancy has gone up throughout the planet, et cetera. The problem with that is efficiency is a little bit like a rubber band. You can stretch a rubber band and it gets more and more efficient, as it were. You're using more and more of it to bind together whatever you're trying to bind. But there's a certain point that rubber bands break. If you push a rubber band past a certain limit, it will break. And we have now constructed a system that relies on this perpetual efficiency, and we do not reward those people who are worried about fragility. We're only rewarding those who are making the system faster and better. And let me just give you an illustration of where this can lead. I think it's a huge amount of hubris. And let me give you 3 examples of where this hubris leads. One is Bruegel's painting of the Tower of Babel. As you probably know the story, humans decided they were almost divine, so they could create a tower that goes up to heaven. Yahweh gets upset about this, says, no, you don't, introduces new languages, and the tower, like a Borges story, sits somewhere ruined in the desert. The second example is the Burj Khalifa, which is used to be the tallest building in the world in Dubai. And this is my favorite example of technological hubris. Why anyone would build a 125-story steel and glass building in a part of the world where A, you have lots of land, and B, temperatures can go up to 125 Fahrenheit in the summer, is beyond me. This is another example of let's make it taller, let's make it shinier, let's make it better, let's make it more efficient, let's show it off. And you can imagine what the fragility is of operating the Burj Khalifa. Okay, just the AC system alone must, consume massive amounts of energy. And then, of course, the last example of the hubris is that we have created for the very first time the means of our own destruction. We no longer have to rely on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We can do it ourselves. And all these are examples of where we've taken science, we've taken development, we've taken technology, and we've escalated, and our dependence on it is such that we're living in very fragile spaces. And I think an awareness of that fragility is a first step towards the future. The second problem I see it, and this is a painting of the Peace of Westphalia, is that we still live in a Westphalian world. In 1648, we managed to resolve the conflict between faith and rule. We still live in a Westphalian world. We still live in a world of nation states. And climate change, but mostly COVID, has clearly shown that you cannot solve global problems using nation states. You cannot have governance defined by territory. You get all incredible amounts of injustices, as previous speakers have said, but it also makes problem solving very, very difficult because the problems are global. They're not national. All I can do is save my own house, but if your house is still burning, my house is in danger. And let me give you an example of where this leads. This is from a very famous comic in 1970 celebrating Earth Day in the United States. And you see these 2 characters, Pogo and Porcupine, they're walking through the swamp. And what you might not be able to see, the resolution isn't great. Then they realize that the swamp is full of garbage, pollution, etc. And Porcupine says, it is hard walking on this stuff. And Pogo's immortal line is, yes, son, we have met the enemy, he is us. And I think we're now at the point that the enemy is us. The enemy is not some other nation. The enemy is not some other tribe. The enemy is not some other. We are our own worst enemies because of this hubris. And we have to start recognizing where that hubris is leading and that we cannot blame our catastrophes on someone else. We are responsible for our own catastrophes, and we have to start assuming that. The third problem, I think, is simply who we are. And here I'm borrowing from Oliver Williamson. And if you think about it, we're not a very attractive species. We're selfish. We're opportunism. This is something Oliver Williamson used to teach. Opportunism is self-seeking behavior with guile. So we're dealing with selfish, opportunistic human beings, dealing with bounded rationality. That is, we cannot know everything that we need to know, and we cannot process that information. We're full of biases, and we still have the mystery of collective behavior. We don't understand how we come together. E.O. Wilson, that Martin quoted before, I mean, he studies ants, and we understand how ants can do this. We understand the chemistry of ants. We do not understand the social chemistry of humans for collective behavior. So not only are we hubristic, not only are we our own worst enemies, but let's not overestimate what we can do. And a wonderful example of this is the person who shared the Nobel with Oliver Williamson is Elinor Ostrom. And Ostrom's law was a research arrangement that works in practice can work in theory. And what she focused on was self-organized governance. Basic, and the two elements are trust and enforced reciprocity, clearly enforced reciprocity. That we have to deal with systems. We're not going to get, my dissertation was on technocrats. There is the technocratic temptation to come up with the model, with the solution. That's not going to happen on a global basis. At the same time that we cannot be in nation states, we can also not expect that a global solution will emerge from on top. We have to see governance from the bottom up. How different societies manage their collective action problems. And we can learn from ourselves, understanding our own limits. So again, limiting our hubris, knowing that we might be our own worst enemies, and trying to learn from the bottom up. I think those are, if I was going to say, the three great goals that we're going to have for a sustainable future. Let's say we achieve that, which is already a lot. Then we have three very difficult choices facing us. And I think these are unavoidable choices. One is the first question of strategy is resilience versus robustness, or if you will, strength versus fragility. We can work to solve problems by either creating walls. Okay, this is the robust. If you see up here, this is where the ball. If you want the ball to rest in the second phase, you have to create this wall. So, and over here. So it will not keep going. This works. This is the principle of a castle wall. You simply create some kind of safety. Okay. The problem is that sometimes you can't predict what the crisis will do. And what you want is some sort of resilience. Okay. You want a system that, yes, it can take a change and keep it, but this part will be variable. And you can't do both. You can't create walls and also create mobile defense. The French army in 1940 is a perfect example of this. The Maginot Line was a huge investment in robustness. The French military had no resilience. So we're going to have to figure out how many risks do we want to totally avoid through robustness, and how much do we have to live with some risks just so we can keep and reserve some sort of resilient resources so we can fix the problem. We have this temptation. We want to, especially I think this is particularly true in the United States. We want insurance for everything. We want everything to be safe. It's impossible. We are wasting energy in trying to make everything safe. What we need to do is, yes, let's keep something safe, but let's also be aware that there are problems that we're not expecting that we're still going to resolve. So again, that's going to be a political decision. The second one is, how do we govern this new global future? And in the literature, there's two possibilities. There's what is known as micro-prudential. That is, regulate the behavior of each agent. You regulate each bank. You make sure that everyone's playing honestly and by the rules. And that's the way we have regulation right now, is we regulate individual behaviors. The problem is that with complex adaptive systems, you have emergence. You have emergent properties that come not from the characteristics of individuals, okay, but actually from the interaction of the individuals in a system. And we don't have, we don't really have oversight or regulation of the system. And that's a very hard thing to do. It's much easier to regulate this one sole trader or one bank. It's much harder to generate a system. The way I always talk about it with my students is, I might have.
I'm sorry, Andrew, please turn off your microphone. Andrew Magre, please turn off your microphone. Well,
as I said, fragile systems.
Andrew, please turn off your phone, please. Andrew. Robson, please turn off the microphone, please. Robson.
Just a moment, please. Just a moment, please.
Alugando aquele kitnet e mais nada. O uso do caso é porque eu deixo isso acontecer, certo? Então.
Okay. All right. So the way I explain this is, for example, those of us who are parents or have been parents, you can perhaps theoretically regulate your child's behavior. What you cannot regulate, no matter how strict or disciplinary a parent, is the behavior of your child's network. You can tell your child don't do this, don't do that, but you cannot regulate a whole system that is created with your child as simply one agent. And we have to come up with systems, and we don't have them. Elinor Ostrom might give us the I think everyone should read Elinor Ostrom a lot, might give us the best indication of how do we regulate not so much behavior, but relationships that lead to certain kind of behavior. And the last thing, and I'm almost done here, the last part is we have to be very, very honest about who wins and who loses. There is the liberal, and I mean the classic liberal with a capital L, John Mill, not John Kerry, had this, it's this illusion that the future has to be a non-zero sum game. Unfortunately, that might be true for a collective. Our aggregate solution might be a non-zero sum game. But inside the system, each person might have some wins and some losses. And for example, on climate change is an obvious, somebody's going to have to give up their economic growth, okay? Not everybody's going to be able to grow quite at the same way, all right? Or with COVID, you can keep all the vaccines, that gives you the insurance, but then that means somebody doesn't have the vaccines. And I think when we're talking about the future, we have to accept the fact that there are these losses and these winners, and we're often very disingenuous about it. In global systems, it's usually the rich who win and the poor who lose. And yet we don't really want to recognize that. And we have to accept the responsibility that comes with that. So again, facing these challenges of hubris and fragility, of us being our own worst enemies, of us not being perfect angels, now we have to decide about who, what are we going to govern? How are we going to govern? We have to decide how much risk we want to prevent as opposed to mitigate, if you will. And then we also have to accept the fact that certainly the people who are probably listening to this call are part of the global winners. And we have to accept the responsibility that comes with that, because as long as we keep winning, someone is likely also losing. And we have to come up with some solutions where the aggregate is actually better than the sum of its parts. And on that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel. Very, very interesting remarks. And of course, I'm quite sure that we'll have opportunity to discuss, the public also, all these inputs you have given to this very interesting and important theme. Now, I would like to call now, let's see, just a moment. Yeah. So Sarah Cornell from Stockholm University. Sarah, please, you have the words.
Hello, thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me fine. And I want to just say it's not only Americans who use PowerPoint. Here we go. Let's hope for this. And even though I've been doing it all year, I still feel a bit of a klutz when I do it. Okay, here we go. Thank you so very much for this opportunity to be involved in an international conference with all the fun and without the carbon that we would have had before. And greetings from Sweden. I want to pick up on several of the themes that we've already heard in this session about global systemic risks, the challenges that today's society faces in terms of resilience to global changes, and of course, the challenges that we face fundamentally for the worlds of science and policy. My own long-standing research question is quite simply, where's the human in Earth system science? That's the field that studies the co-evolution of the physical climate on Earth and Earth's living environment as well, life and climate. So today, rather than actually describing the science of global change itself, I want to focus more on these really big themes from the perspective of the place of this kind of science, global change science, in desirable and resilient tomorrows. So yeah, let's start by reflecting on risk and resilience and reality in terms of these linked social and ecological changes that play out at all scales, from the very microscopic, like a virus, to the whole planet. I usually use this very broad definition of resilience, just quite simply, the capacity of a system to cope with change and to continue to develop. For me, resilience is a very powerful concept because it links social and ecological change, and also because it spans processes of change that play out across time and spatial scales. We often draw this little loop, a kind of heuristic adaptive cycle. It's a very simple model of change in complex living systems. It's really a defining characteristic of life that it will seek to exploit its surroundings and expand until it hits some kind of constraint. And then its options are crash or change. And this little simple model applies equally well to populations of rabbits in a meadow, or societal reorganizations of the kinds that we've been hearing about, really, of urban regeneration, for example, and also to the kinds of planetary changes that happen, let's say, following a mass extinction event. So when it comes to thinking about the future, I think we've got really important opportunities and maybe scientific responsibilities to learn from Earth's past. In some recent work led by my colleague Will Steffen, we explored the risk of pushing Earth's biophysical dynamics, in other words, these feedbacks between life and climate, into new trajectories that threaten human activities at the very largest of scales. In our Trajectories paper, we examined several natural experiments in Earth history that help us to show the planet's intrinsic capacity to adapt and recover from the kinds of perturbations that we are giving it right now. So I'm just going to focus quickly, I often use this example too, setting today's environmental changes into the very long-term and very large-scale context of Earth history. This graph, I've stolen it from Wikipedia, is a multi-metric reconstruction of just one indicator of global change, Earth's temperature. It goes back 500 million years, and rather confusingly, each panel in the graph zooms in on time. The period that I generally focus on is this relatively stable time of the Holocene, the last 10,000 years. That's the work that we do on, for instance, the planetary boundaries concept that I'll mention later. But I often use this graph to highlight the fact that actually Earth has experienced widely different conditions in its history. But I also want to emphasize that we understand the wiggles on this graph, scientifically speaking. By combining different kinds of Earth observation and different models, and obviously theoretic understanding too, we, by which I mean the scientific community, we understand the astronomic and the geological constraints, the forcing of the system, and we understand the interplay of the physics, the chemistry, and the biology of the planet that link land, ocean, ice, and atmosphere. This scientific understanding is the basis of our predictive power for the climate system as a whole. And right now, the collective activities of human beings on Earth are messing up, let's say, or certainly are changing, are perturbing the physics, the chemistry, and the biology of the whole planet, all at the same time. And this is changing the system feedbacks between life and climate that maintained this comparatively stable Holocene. And it's really pushing us into really quite profound uncertainty about the future. In a sense, the further we go into the future, the more desperately we need to look in the past for something that we can use as a precedent for these biophysical interactions. I didn't want to be pessimistic, but here we go. The strongest ambitions of today's climate policy take the world into climate conditions, at the moment, the best predictions, by the end of this century, that have their closest precedents, biogeochemically speaking, 3 million years ago. And of course, because the world isn't just physics, the conditions can't be captured just in this one temperature indicator that I'm showing here. So in short, we, humanity as a whole this time, are moving into an unprecedented, poorly predictable, and uncertain future. But the insights from the past mean the one thing we can be sure of is that risks are rising. So let's just have a quick look at today's reality. I meant to say I'll be sharing these slides, so I don't feel you have to read everything. We know that today's world is highly interconnected. And at the same time, that means that people are becoming increasingly disconnected, or many people, from their supporting ecosystems. This figure is just from some work by my colleagues at the Stockholm Environment, sorry, not those colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, indicating the kinds of interactions that kind of get reformed and reshaped through processes like trade and finance. We've heard a lot already about inequalities, and obviously this past year has exposed inequalities, and there's quite a strong scientific consensus among economists that we have increased inequalities too. Sorry, I got distracted by chats. Then we also know that the planet is already under pressure. We, and this time, not just scientists, but policymakers, businesses, and citizens alike, we know that the current level of societal exploitation and expansion into the ecological world is a really bad idea. We document in ever more detail this progressive decline of wild nature, the demands on the living environment and natural resources, and of course, the growing social problems that come from that. So what does this all mean for our tomorrows? Now, fortunately, we know some fundamental properties that shape the resilience of complex systems. So for convenience, let's just focus on 3: connectivity between the components of the system, the diversity that allows for a range of possible responses to a perturbation, and the redundancy, which simply means that there's more than one system for coping with change. We can start to, well, it's no surprise to you that I'm going to argue that science contributes to all 3 of these factors of resilience. Let's call it Earth resilience, resilience on the larger scale. Knowledge helps us to retrace the social ecological connections that matter. Engagement with other knowledge systems helps us to find alternative options for informed action. And increasingly, we're recognizing that it isn't just about a knowledge world, but getting our hands in it together. We if we open new kinds of dialogue, action-oriented dialogues with different actors, we can help to create the capacity to experiment and innovate for change. So let's focus on the kind of the downward curve of the resilience loop, this release phase that presents us with a choice of change, crash, or, well, change or crisis, crash or change. For the last 40 years, I've already shown this little picture, but I'm going to ram the point home. Global assessments of unsustainability have been published. And every year they get thicker, they get more well evidenced. And so in that sense, we're not facing a knowledge gap about the future. In recent years, scientists have started to shift to assessing and quantifying the implementation gaps and the costs of inaction as well. You hear that scientists are becoming increasingly concerned about global change. We do our best to synthesize and simplify our messages and transmit them in ways that can be used. The planetary boundaries is a framework that really helps to translate the multidimensional risks that are playing out at global change context. So it's kind of perhaps understandable that scientists are asking, well, okay, we've given people the science. Why isn't the world acting yet? I mean, we've gone beyond saying it's because the social scientists aren't on board now. But I've become more and more interested in this very old idea from physiology of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries that makes a distinction between crisis, this kind of decisive do or die, rather depressingly, win or lose moment, and lysis, the slow crumbling apart and the slow, unavoidable breaking down of the system of an organism in physiology. But it's rather disturbing when we start to think that maybe we won't see a tipping point, maybe we won't see a threshold, maybe our actions are simply undermining the world that we see at the moment. I did not mean to be pessimistic, I'm sorry. But it can be really helpful if we stop thinking of the environmental crisis like a proper crisis and start to understand it from the perspective of resilience and the perspective of this release phase and the reorganizations that become possible as a consequence. For a long time now, I've described myself to my students as a post-neo-transdisciplinarian, and they think it's a joke. And it's kind of a joke. I mean, it started as a joke, but like the best jokes, it's a serious joke. So I want to talk to you about the challenges that I see now for the science for tomorrow in terms of post-neo-transdisciplinarity. The really inspiring scientist Stephen Schneider wrote a very long time ago about transdisciplinarity. That's where we bring our knowledge from different disciplines together and we try to inform action in society about it. I love this quote about the morally reprehensible status of universities. We'll pick up on that theme too, perhaps. If we don't deal with transdisciplinary issues, taking our knowledge, but back in the 90s, the question was very much focused on this role of scholars, particularly in the science policy interfaces that mattered for global change. About a decade later, as people recognized that the technocrats couldn't fix everything, the increasing complexification of society started to get attention. And of course, the multiple claims of knowledge, having to listen to indigenous knowledge, for instance. Imagine the shock for scientists. So Galopin and his colleagues focused that, this is why I call it the neo-transdisciplinary part, it's not just the role of science, but the nature of science itself that was changing. And here we are now. Why have I gone post-neo-transdisciplinary? One of my favorite quotes in the last decade or so is from this article by Leslie Head, who points out that, kind of we've got the science on the table, but this is precisely where now we've got multiple ontologies that need to be reformed, renegotiated some way. We, in this endlessly constructed and negotiated world, we really need to be thinking much more broadly about what reality is and how we as scientists may influence it. This is the positive side of post-neo-transdisciplinarity, but the negative side in some ways is something that I want to draw attention to because it's a cause for concern as well. Post-neo-transdisciplinarity has worrying aspects that I think scientists as a whole need to reflect upon. We perhaps overemphasize quantification. The solidity of our knowledge is being politicized and pluralized in this post-truth world. So I think we need to reflect more on the skills for this post-neo-transdisciplinary world we must live in. And here, I think that we can return to the principles of resilience. We can make deeper social ecological connections than just the material level. This is where the zero-sum question might require us to look more broadly at cognitive, experiential, and emotional aspects of life. We need to look beyond the perspectives that have dominated science policy interactions, the privileged and the elite. And of course, we need to think about going beyond these dominant interfaces for global change science and policy to look at the many other channels and arenas that give options for coping under conditions of slow burn crisis. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very nice talk. In fact, I like the idea of widened dialogues. And I think in Brazil, we are especially gifted for that, in the sense that we do have indigenous people who have notions about the environment that actually are quite close to those that have been developed recently in Europe and in other places about, say, the One Health thesis, human health, animal health, environment health. They consider this for centuries. They have considered that. They have this concept. In fact, Yanomamis here in Brazil, they say that even their dreams are different from the dreams of what they call white civilization. Because they say, it's funny, white civilization, white people only dream about themselves. We dream about the forest, we dream about the animals. So even dreams are different. So, I think the concept of widened dialogue is a very important one, and we should actually have it with people outside the universities. And maybe that's a very good way to build a sustainable future. Anyway, now we have 5 minutes for cross comments among you. I don't know if I go through all of them. Maybe I just leave it like that, short comments on what has been said here. Anyone wants to start? If not, I'll just call, with the order we had in the beginning. So let's see, Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, because I'm still absorbing a lot of what's been said, I'm not sure I'll articulate that well all my ideas. But I was interested in a couple of things that come out, and from panel one as well, about trying to engage the popular imagination. That seems to come across quite a lot. So I think that's something we need to work on. But also these ideas about how we inspire I think the younger generation is already quite inspired to engage with these issues. So what is it we can do to give them more tools, to help engage them further, and to get them filling the gaps that I feel we can't do so well. So I like others here, study international governance for years and years, but I've struggled to say, okay, what is it we can do differently? What's the innovation here? So I would love to see the younger generations coming up with some of the innovations about governance.
Thank you. Martin?
You're muted, Martin.
You're muted, yeah. This is the sentence most
okay.
heard nowadays. You are muted.
Sorry about that. Yes. Okay, now, of course, we are addressing the world problems, but we are all academics in universities, so I just wanted to focus on things closer to our immediate concerns, and to make the point that I think education, especially higher education, is probably the most sclerotic aspect of our culture, in that it's far too traditional. We are far too specialized, and the idea that we have 3 years between age 18 and 21 maybe full time, and then no access to university is completely wrong. We've got to have a intermittent lifelong education and all that, and in a wider range of subjects relevant to the big problems we're discussing. And I think it's up to us in universities to try and ensure that the curriculum and the dialogue is changed. And of course, one of the upsides of COVID-19 is that we have had to think about how new technology can change our way of teaching, and perhaps allow us to develop contact we couldn't develop otherwise. So I think it's a parochial statement, but we are all academics, so I think we ought to try and encourage our institutions to enter the challenge of the modern world more effectively than they do up to now.
Thank you very much, Martin. Indeed, we think about the future, but our new universities are very often connected to the past. So,
right.
Thank you.
And our schools as well.
Yeah, schools as well, sure. And Mathieu, please. Mathieu.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour vos apports qui convergent finalement, et pas seulement dans le diagnostic, dans une partie aussi de la réponse. Et moi, j'ai noté plein de choses, mais il y en a deux que j'aimerais partager avec vous. Luiz, vous avez mis dans la discussion du monde à venir une partie des traditions anciennes. Et moi, je trouve qu'il y a quelque chose d'enthousiaste en ce moment, c'est qu'il y a autant de la place dans le futur qui arrive pour de la découverte, du neuf, lié notamment avec la puissance technologique inégalée, qui était le rêve peut-être du 19e siècle, voire même le rêve peut-être du 18e siècle, c'est-à-dire de connecter les humains entre eux grâce au rhizome, au mycélium Internet. Et puis, il y a la place pour de la redécouverte, pour celles et ceux dans les traditions de sagesse qui nous invitent à redécouvrir la Terre en conscience. Et ça aussi, c'est une exploration incroyable, aussi fantastique que d'aller sur Mars. Et c'est nous qui sommes hors sol depuis 500 ans, et quelque chose de profondément va nous impacter et va nous inviter à retourner vers l'essentiel, qui est peut-être la promesse équilibrée d'un futur souhaitable. L'autre chose, Miguel, vous parliez du traité de Westphalie. Il a structuré nos 500 dernières années en simplement racontant que derrière une frontière, il y avait un souverain et une religion, et on essayait absolument d'arrêter les guerres de religion et de contester ni l'un ni l'autre. Peut-être, et donc les déclarations d'indépendance ont été un ferment de liberté durant la période des Lumières. Peut-être que le ferment de liberté du XXIe siècle, c'est maintenant de faire des déclarations d'interdépendance et plus des déclarations d'indépendance pour nous connecter entre nous humains, mais aussi entre les non-humains et les humains, qui sera peut-être l'étape d'après, c'est-à-dire la symbiose plus que l'anthropocentrisme, qui encore une fois nous a libérés à la Renaissance, mais qui nous conduit peut-être droit dans le mur. Et donc, le dernier présent pour l'avenir que j'aimerais vous faire, c'est une invitation à faire sur nous une partie peut-être du premier pas, à travers 3 A, une invitation peut-être à abandonner quelque chose qu'on fait et qu'on ne veut plus voir dans le monde d'après, qu'on fait au quotidien. Un deuxième A, ce serait d'améliorer quelque chose qu'on fait, mais qu'on peut mieux faire si on prenait le temps d'optimiser, de faire différemment, de tester autre chose. Et le troisième A, ce serait d'adopter quelque chose de nouveau pour voir si ça nous plaît. Et ce serait peut-être un début de déplacement collectif vers un mouvement général qui serait de passer à autre chose, encore une fois, une autre civilisation peut-être.
Merci, Mathieu. Thank you very much. Miguel, Centeno, your remarks.
I want to. We're all beating up on universities, and I can't think of an institution that deserves it more. My question is, how do we address the increasing illegitimization, not just of universities, of scientific knowledge? And it's very easy. I mean, this is the classic. to blame the person who is no longer holding science legitimate. And we blame that person and we say, can't you see, why can't you take science at its worth? And we very rarely turn the question around and said, what have we done to delegitimize it to such an extent? And I think universities certainly have done that. The elitist perspective, the still disciplinary cones that we define ourselves. You know, I don't know how many tenure discussions I have been part of where it's never asked if the person is smart. It's asked if the person is a good sociologist. Well, actually, I care more about someone being smart than about them being a sociologist. And we've done this, the universities have abandoned this. And just a small other comment, if we were going to focus on anything, Sarah, thank you so much for introducing that term lysis. I'd never heard of it, but I think that's the one word version of what Martin was referring to with the frog inside the boiling water. And I really think that we should start talking more about lysis of climate change rather than crisis of climate change. Because crisis allows us, we'll do this or we'll do that. Lysis is, we don't even know we're decaying. And I really thank you so much for that concept. I had never heard of it, and I'm going to steal it for many things from now on.
Thank you. Thank you. I also enjoyed very much that concept, lysis. Very nice concept, very adequate, very good. So, Sarah, please, your comments.
That's a really lovely point to put in, because it's actually, I'm going to give credit to the idea of it came from a PhD student at the Royal Technical University here in Stockholm, Eric Pallier, and he got it from somewhere else too. So in my slides, if anyone in the audience wants to see it, I'll share the slides later. You can trace this idea. And I think it is, I mean, I find the minute I heard him describe it, I went, oh, it hits you in the gut in a very different way than all of the kind of crisis story that we hear all the time. I think there's this very much the language of crisis. And, you know, many of my most senior colleagues have been really, I mean, quite rightly calling for action as a matter of urgency, using the language of crisis, saying we must transform now. I mean, I think it opens up a huge range of different options for action. If you think we're not just going to hit a wall and either win or die, but somehow we kind of need to muddle along in a deeply fragile system for a very, very long time because of the near-ish recent past. In the chat, we've had a little bit of a discussion around this idea of obviously youth. And at the same time, we've had this sort of undercurrent of the importance of the great elders, of the traditions, the kind of indigenous peoples, for instance, who hand on knowledge of their place, of their relationships to their world, from generation to generation. So I think there's something really interesting about the telescoping of time that also Mathieu's comments on this too, the kind of, you know, that time isn't what it used to be in a sense. And the upside of all this postmodern kind of hand wavy stuff, she says, as a proper good old fashioned scientist, is that we can explore these multiple temporalities in very new ways. And again, I think that I love the idea of the, you know, there's several people talking about the good ancestor, that kind of, you know, how does this generation want to be looked back on? Extending the scope of our responsibility from just this quarter or this year or this term of office to, you know, to a much bigger time frame. There was so much to pick in on this. I'm also really struck a little bit around some of the ideas about the creativity, especially now as, you know, kind of people seem to mix up science and fiction, evidence and hearsay and wishing and greenwash and everything else. I mean, you know, there's so many, at a time when there's so much information at our fingertips, it's becoming so much harder to be discerning about the relationships that really matter. our human relationships and our social interactions. I mean, we could pick up nation states and universities. Oh, there's so much. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. So we are now going to go to the questions from those who are listening to this talk. First of all, I would like to say that if we are here together, and if people are enjoying these talks and all this conference, we owe that to 3 women, in fact. Ana Célia Castro, who is the director of the Brazilian College of High Studies, Tatiana Roque, who is director of the Forum of Science and Culture, and Denise Pires de Carvalho, who is the president of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So these 3 women have been doing a fantastic work towards the internationalization of the university, which is, of course, essential for any university. And so we owe to them this panel and this conference. Now, I would like to say just a few, 1 minute of some words, which is maybe a view from the South, on universities and on the denialism, actually, that affects, of course, everybody in the world. But, you know, I think there are many sides to the denialism and many reasons for that. You know, and when we see, when you notice that, you know, in a country like Brazil, but also in other countries from the developing world, millions of people are excluded from higher education, sometimes even from basic education. Then you can understand why they sometimes look at the universities with, you know, suspicious eye in how they are very easily mobilized by some politicians towards, you know, denialism and towards criticism of universities, actually. So they say, okay, so I cannot have access to that. Maybe it's not so good, and I can live without that. So that's one of the factors. Of course, there are many other factors, but I believe that these inequalities between nations and also within nations is a major problem we must face, because that affects also the understanding that people have of science. That, you know, it's for us, I think we have a consensus towards, you know, climate change, the effect of human beings on climate change, the way to go towards pandemics, the problem of deforestation and the influence of the environment on future pandemics. We know that, but there are millions and millions of people who do not understand that, and we should find ways to talk with them. Of course, just not talk, but I think it's our moral responsibility also to fight against inequality, which means really changing the system, and we should work towards that. I think universities have a very important role in this direction, as long as they become, of course, interdisciplinary, as long as they incentivize interdisciplinary studies, as long as there is communication between these different departments that are very specialized. You have mentioned that, and I think that was very important for you to mention that. And I think that's a major problem that we as academic people can confront. And if I would have a question, it's just one, then I'm going to read the questions from the public. You have not mentioned international organizations. And I wonder, what do you think about that? Because there are, you know, I'm in TWAS, it's the World Academy of Sciences for the Advancement of Science in Developing Countries. The main point of TWAS is capacity building. But then what I find is that science, through this international organization, breaks the walls of fears that have also been mentioned here, the castle walls that were mentioned here, and science helps to go through them. I have seen Palestinians and Israelis working together in this accelerator in Jordania. I have seen people working together towards understanding this pandemic. in countries that are fighting one against other, but scientists communicate. So I think that's a very important role of science, but it's sort of canalized, it's channeled through these international organizations. And I think we should pay attention to them. Maybe they're not so effective, but we should actually work for them to be more effective. And I mentioned, for instance, the World Academy of Sciences, IAP, which is the Inter-Academy Partnership, and of course, World Health Organization, which played an important role in this crisis, in spite of the resistance of some countries. United Nations, UNESCO, they are fragilized. They are fragilized. And I think it's very important to support them and to try to strengthen these organizations so that people can communicate, even people from nations that are in war one with the other, or they don't like each other, but scientists can communicate through international organizations. So that's just the remark. And I'd like to see to know what you think about these international organizations that were not mentioned in this panel. So that's my question. Where do they come into this picture?
I mean, I can answer in relation to the sort of area I presented on, because originally when I started thinking through these things about scientific responsibilities, so going back quite a while, but it had been, okay, well, you can't really ascribe those responsibilities directly to individuals. It's just so varied what the individual circumstances is, that to tell them that they've got to do all these things and fulfill all these responsibilities is not helpful. But what you do is collectivize that. So where the responsibilities lie within the community, and it often is sort of channeled into things like academies, science academies. And I think what I'd also say is actually getting those academies to recognize the value of the role they have within policy processes is really important. That they form an intermediary between the scientist on the ground, the practicing scientist, and the international level of policy. Because I've been at meetings organized by science academies where they're saying this is a crisis in governance, the international community can't cope with keeping pace with science and technology advance. And part of my message back to them was that, but you're part of governance, you are part of a system and you can play a role. So I think that's a kind of important thing to draw out, that we do have some agency within those political systems.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a question that comes from the public. There is one here, a short question, and then a more involved question. I'll start with the short question. It's a question from Tiago Lima. How those human futures and present can cope with capitalism?
I mean, that's an impossible question, but
I agree.
What's very interesting, I've done this experiment. If you read the Communist Manifesto, instead of where it says capitalism, globalization. And it's not just capitalism, it's capitalism combined with globalization. And despite, with all due respect to Adam Smith, the emergent properties that come out of this combination of globalization and capitalism are not always benign. So I don't think we can just talk about capitalism. I think we have to talk about global capitalism and what that implies and what the particular problems are with that. Because capitalism allows you to follow your own individual interests in the hope that collectively will come out to something better. But with globalization, that might not be true. My progress might lead to your regress, and we have to accept those responsibilities.
Thank you, Miguel. Anybody else who would like to mention?
Luiz, yes? May I ask? Yeah, just a moment. May I ask Tatiana Roque to ask her question, please? But sure. First, Martin, sure. Sorry to interrupt.
Martin?
Sorry. I just wanted to say that one thing which has changed is the greater dominance of multinational companies, which can't be properly regulated or taxed by any particular nation. and which therefore obviously require in parallel some new international organizations which can genuinely regulate them. So that's a really new kind of capitalism.
Okay, any further comment on that? May I go to the next question? Okay, so the question is to Professor Martin Rees, which is the following. We are aware that it is necessary to intensify research on the goals for 2050 now. The most vulnerable will always be at risk in every way. It is necessary to innovate in biomimetics and microbiology. Innovating in the area of food is crucial. In Brazil, we have the largest amount of high-quality fruits, vegetables, grains, and natural resources. Does the professor believe that all countries can help each other through the use of the internet today to maintain this diversity and environmental sustainability?
Well, I indeed think it's crucial, and we certainly have to obviously have efficient and cheap clean energy, and we have to have sustainable but intensive agriculture to avoid encroaching on natural forests, although we have to feed 9 billion people. All those things are crucial, and we have much of the technology, but we need more of it. And I certainly think that the countries of the north can do far more by redirecting their research effort towards these problems. In fact, I was just writing an article this morning on the point that in my country, Great Britain, we produce 1.5% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. We have a plan to go to zero by 2050, but that doesn't change the world very much. But I think if we in our country, where we've got quite a good tradition of innovation, really prioritized clean energy, more efficient and cheaper storage, smart grids, and all the rest of it, then that would make it easier and cheaper for countries of the South, countries where they are going to need more energy per capita and have a rising population to achieve those goals without producing more CO2. So I think the countries like my own can do far more towards global net zero by advanced research and development to help countries like India achieve cost-effective clean energy. And I think also the same is true of the countries which are very good at genetic GM crops and things of that kind, because we're going to need all those technologies to feed the world. So I think this is a very inspiring goal for young scientists and engineers to try and provide accessible, cheap food and energy for all parts of the world.
Thank you, Martin. I think Tatiana Rocky has a question now. Tatiana.
Bom, vou perguntar em português, porque eu quero ser bem precisa.
Okay, now
Primeiro,
do we have translations for that into English? Do we Tatiana? Or
yes, yes. Okay, please
good.
find interpretation channel.
Tá bem.
Below.
Bom, então, primeiro
okay,
agradecer
please.
demais, as intervenções foram maravilhosas e acho que apontam um caminho para a gente também na universidade em direção à transdisciplinaridade e também a enfrentar esses problemas que implicam uma maior proximidade entre a universidade e a sociedade. Eu estou ouvindo a tradução, então não sei o que fazer. Eu estou ouvindo a tradução ao mesmo tempo em que eu falo, então não sei o que fazer para continuar.
Você pode...
Vou tentar, mas é difícil se concentrar assim.
Então, desliga o fone.
Mas eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta que tem a ver também com a minha própria pesquisa em História e Filosofia da Ciência e sobre a imagem pública da ciência. Todos vocês falaram da questão da governança, que é colocada num certo impasse com as mudanças climáticas e outras mudanças globais que a gente está sofrendo, e que o nosso sistema de governança parece não ser adequado, né, a esses problemas atuais. E uma das premissas desse sistema de governança, que é muito presente, inclusive, nos fóruns multilaterais, incluindo sobre as mudanças climáticas, é o papel da ciência como intermediário no convencimento público, não só dos tomadores de decisão, como também da sociedade e do público em geral. E, para além dos problemas que o Luiz Davidovich já colocou, que são específicos do Brasil, problemas de educação, de desigualdade, a gente tem uma crise de confiança na ciência que é mais profunda e mais geral do que isso, que afeta todos os lugares do mundo, há pesquisas mostrando isso, etc. E como ficou claro, inclusive, tanto na questão da crise climática quanto na questão da pandemia, a gente tem uma imagem pública da ciência que parece não ser adequada ao tipo de ciência e ao tipo de relação entre ciência e sociedade que as mudanças climáticas trazem, inclusive que a pandemia também trouxe. Um exemplo muito claro. A imagem pública da ciência é associada a certezas, né? A previsibilidade. E a gente aqui está falando de ciências que lidam com incertezas de uma maneira muito profunda e mesmo estrutural. E a nossa comunicação pública da ciência, ela não é ainda adequada a um modo de tratar as incertezas que estão presentes nessa ciência, e que eu acho que, inclusive, foi uma questão com a pandemia e na comunicação científica durante a pandemia. Então, eu queria perguntar sobre isso para todos, mas eu acho que a Sara talvez tenha falado disso mais especificamente, que seria como a gente ultrapassar também uma imagem pública da ciência que está mais associada ao século XIX e que vem sendo questionada desde o pós-guerra, como a gente sabe, com as questões de risco, a questão atômica, a questão climática e a questão da interferência da tecnologia nos modos de vida de uma maneira mais ampla. Então, bom, é isso. Espero que tenha ficado claro.
Yeah, very good, Tatiana. Thank you very much for raising this point. Indeed, I think we are, I mean, our times are times of in which the uncertainties of science also quite evident, and somehow we should transmit to the public. I think that's part of what you said, that, you know, this is part of science. Science, you know, the truth of science is not absolute. If it was absolute, science would not exist, right? So, but very, very, very good. Thank you very much. So, you know, please, could you comment on what Tatiana said?
Luiz, could I just say one thing? I'm sorry, Luiz?
Yes.
I just want to, we all keep talking about science as if the answer is in science. I think the example of Brazil and India and COVID show it's not simply a question of science, it's a question of politics.
Sure.
Did Brazil have the capacity to avoid these hundreds of thousands of deaths? Absolutely. India is the largest producer of many of these vaccines. And yet, because of political decisions, so I want to encourage all the younger generation to go into science and believe in science, but I also want to encourage them to go and believe in politics, because we might come up with great scientific solutions, but if no politician is willing to implement it, it's for naught.
Thank you, Miguel. Any further comments?
As you can imagine, I've got some.
Very good.
I think, again, I want to tie this question. I can't answer the question here. I'll follow up with Tatiana separately on answering the question. But I think there's something really interesting about the vulnerability of science. I mean, and by science, I don't just mean the techno sciences. I really wish in English we had the bigger sense of kind of knowledging the world that comes through these habits of scholarship and inquiry. So I'm using big science, or the big meaning of science in this conversation. Right now, we see that science is the science that enabled globalization to, you know, kind of, or at least played a role in making globalization possible. is now vulnerable to precisely those trends of globalization too. We see that, kind of the machinery around science has become so much bigger than the effort of science itself. We see, this is part of the reason in my kind of post-neo-transdisciplinary discussion, there's a whole lot of things that bother me greatly at the moment, like the immense increase in predatory journals. They're not all predatory, but just the huge business of publication is now pushing science faster than science can think. Now, on one level, we didn't want the cozy little incestuous publication houses we had. Many of us who've wanted a more sort of internationalized science really have worked hard to make journals not be just the white Western world represented in the publications of the literature. So, kind of part of the expansion of the publication industry to many countries all around the world, we were very positive about it at the beginning, but now it's grown so fast that people don't even bother reading research articles for research excellence assessments. Now, I think there's something really quite, obviously, luckily, we're still writing it for posterity too. But yes, there's a lovely question in the chat. Does slow science help to decrease this problem? I think there is something about really, for me, the whole challenge is how do we maintain the habits of thinking and reflexivity that are actually the core principles of scholarship that mean that universities were a place to protect that. There are lots of other things too, but it becomes very hard to protect what it means to be a scientist when there's constant demands for a solution and a response and an action and a participation and a consensus and 10 top messages. And I'm exhausted by the buzz that looks scientific, but that can no longer be really traceable to its deep understanding of the world. Bothers the heck out of me. Yes, now I've made Martin raise his hand.
Thank you, Sarah. We are approaching the end of this panel. And Araceli, we have other questions from YouTube, but I don't know if we'll have time to formulate the question.
We'll see. But Martin wants to have a comment,
to
make a comment. Sorry.
Well, I want to agree with Sarah and say that in universities, the sort of audit culture has had detrimental effects on discouraging deep thought and long-term projects. I think we need to do that. But on the other hand, I'm not quite as pessimistic about science denial. I think certainly in our country, the COVID-19 episode has been good for science because we've had very capable scientists speaking frankly on the television, explaining the uncertainties, why they're changing their minds, etc. The politicians haven't followed it quickly enough, but they have eventually followed. But I think the public has got the idea that there's nothing that special about the scientific method. It's no different from what a detective or someone like that does in trying to assess evidence, and that they start off uncertain, but sometimes things firm up. So I'm not that pessimistic, and I think that the presentation by many, many medical scientists, certainly in the UK over the last year, has been very helpful to the public, and I think good for the image of science.
Very good. Thank you very much, Martin. And I should say here too in Brazil, I think science has been in evidence in newspapers, and maybe a collateral effect of this pandemic is that newspapers have approached the scientific community. They have opened their spaces to the scientific community much more than before. That's true. And as for the connection between science and politics, which was mentioned before by Tatiana, I should say that even some academies of science, like the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, of which I'm now the president, they have a kind of heterodox action now. They're not just talking about science; they're criticizing also the politics of the government, in particular the economic policy that is increasing inequality in Brazil, and that is really having extremely bad effects on the health of the people and on the future possibilities of them. So, you know, I think we have to do that. It's a kind of moral obligation to have that. We talk about science, we have webinars on science, but we also criticize the policies of the government, which are afflicting a big part of the population. So we have now, Ana Célia, what we do, we are at the end. So
I would suggest that we can send the questions to all the panelists after this conference. I think we have to end now. But anyway, I want to ask all of you that are in the Zoom room to appear. So please, please open your videos and your screens, please do it, because then we can just appear and make a goodbye. Priscilla, Célia.
We should change to gallery view. Gallery view.
Yeah, to gallery view, please. Yes, please. And also I would like to thank the translators because they did a very good job. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think we can stop recording and then we can just talk a little more. Yes. Can we stop recording, please? It takes a time. It's not immediately.
Just a moment, please.
Wait.
Just a moment, please.
Okay.
I'm afraid I have to go. My poor dog has been barking for the last hour and needs to go out. So I have to go rescue my dog.
That's why we have seen you.
My dog is not sustainable. Bye.
Bye. Thank you
very much.
Bye, Claudio Maretti, Gary Jimsky. Yes. I think this was a great convergence of